Hello there.
Okay, calling Chris Anderson. You're in
Another note somewhere.
you're in a Radisson hotel room. I think it's what my mind is
That's the
telling me.
vibe. That's the vibe. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm in
Where are you?
Radisson. I'm in Radisson and Wrocław, Poland.
Wow,
Yeah.
fantastic.
And you are?
I'm in the same old pop stand here in Chicago.
Yeah.
Last time, I think for the next month, I'm going to be on the road, but this is my last time here until early October. Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. And you can check out their rich offering of military history tours at StephenAmbroseTours.com. And Chris, whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast, we're glad you're here. And today, we're talking about the extraordinary New York woman who became America's, I think, fair to say, first great crime boss. And we should thank, I don't know, maybe we shouldn't do this right next to saying great crime boss, but we should thank our Patreon supporters. This is not a crime operation. This is entirely legal. And anyway, you can join us as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com.
And we really appreciate the help.
History Happy Hour. Chris, where are you going to be? You're going to be back in London next Sunday, right?
Yeah, Sunday I'm going to get to go home and do some laundry, and then I go out on the road again on Thursday.
I'll be in London next Sunday too, but I'm not sure we're going to get much closer than in a couple. I don't know. We'll have to see what goes there.
Well, maybe I'll invite you to the Air Force Club then.
I might be open. So, do we have anybody? Is it just you and I today, or is there?
It's live. People joining us. Susan's joining us from Maryland, and Wally from Indiana. Lou Mumford from City, Maryland. Even though she's supposed to be here, but we won't get into that right now. So she's getting better. And there's somebody named Catherine Beyer-Hurst.
Catherine Beyer-Hurst, we do know her, and lots of people. By the way, guys, Chris being in a I'm just going to say Chris is in a hotel room in Poland. The Wi-Fi is a little funky, so we're just going to put up with it. We understand it's happening. Not much we can do about it. Chris, are you ready to begin this show?
I am. Okay.
So make it happen.
The bar is open.
The bar's open, everybody. Frederika Mandlebaum was a nice Jewish mother living in New York in the 1870s, but she was also America's first great organized crime boss. She planned robberies throughout the country and turned street crime into big business. HHH alum Margalit Fox has written a new book about her, The Talented Mrs. Mandlebaum, The Rise and Fall of an American Organized Crime Boss. Margalit has written many books. She has been a journalist. She's done all sorts of stuff, but she's been on the show before, so you know who she is. Margot, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Welcome back to History Happy Hour.
It's great to be back.
I neglected before I introduced you to ask Chris if he had a cocktail, so I have to do it now. I'm sorry. I'm contractually obligated to. Yeah. Chris.
It's not water this time. There's actually fruit floating in it, so it's a gin and tonic.
Okay. Fair enough. I'm drinking beer. You know, it's not a good German beer. It's a nice American IPA. But,
and I have my coffee.
Excellent. Well done. So somebody's going to be sober on this call.
Somebody can drive home, right? Yeah.
Ish.
Thank you. So, Margalit, I think it's a fair question simply to say, how the heck did you dig this one up? Okay. Where did this come from?
Same way I dig up all my books, which is pulling down long out of print volumes from my personal library at home. So when my last book, The Confidence Men, was in production, I was casting around for what to do next. And I think what will intrigue your viewers is that I came to this absolutely true story of Frederika Mandlebaum through a spurious story. So it's a good cautionary tale for the historian or journalist. What happened was this. The volume I pulled down when I was casting about for what to do was a very large reference book that was an encyclopedia of crime and criminals. And for reasons that will become obvious, I'm not going to name the book or the compiler because it turned out there were problems with at least one of the entries. The book fell as if by divine providence, it fell open to an entry headed Grand Street School. Now, Grand Street is a street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, still there, and the entry was tantalizing. It maintained that in the mid 19th century, there was a brick and mortar educational academy down on Grand Street in which young American Oliver Twists, aspiring robbers, pickpockets, jewel thieves, could actually go to school and learn these gentle arts of their trade. The school was said to have been run by a woman named Frederika Mandlebaum, who was an immigrant from German lands, Jewish mother, who supposedly ran this school and ran a whole criminal organization. Now, this is a classic case of something sounding too good to be true that is, in fact, too good to be true. A minute or less of online research told me that the Grand Street School was an urban legend that had arisen in the mid 19th century. I was eventually able to trace where and how, and persists, regrettably, to this day. So that was a washout. However, the principal of the school, Mrs. Frederika Mandlebaum, was very real. And while she may not have run a brick and mortar educational academy, she was indeed the first major organized crime boss in America. And that was more than enough for me to start work on a new book.
Yeah. So why don't we start though? Kind of some background. How did a nice Jewish girl wind up in New York? And so a little bit of her backstory and what kind of environment is she coming into?
Right. In other words, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?
Something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Because I don't know.
Frederika Mandlebaum was born in Kassel in what is now central Germany in the 1820s, and she was from a family of threadbare Jewish peddlers. Jewish life in the old country was anything but easy. Jews were subject to restrictions on the trades they could ply, on the areas in which they could live, which by extension restricted whom they could marry. They were sometimes subjected to violence. And in 1850, her husband Wolf, who was also a peddler, and their infant daughter joined thousands of other immigrants on the passage to America in search of a better life. She made the crossing in steerage under sail, 6 weeks in darkness below deck, cramped, filthy, disease-ridden, malodorous, and she and her husband and their infant daughter fetched up on the Lower East Side in an immigrant diaspora known as Klein Deutschland, Little Germany. They lived in the worst kind of tenement poverty, 20 or more families packed into a single flimsy small apartment building, no running water, no sanitation, overflowing sewage in the backyards from communal outhouses used by the whole building, the streets around them strewn with garbage, bands of roaming pigs, residential buildings, cheek by jowl with foundries and abattoirs.
So it's a lot like your neighborhood, Chris.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah.
And the Mandelbaums live like that in the filthy, disease-ridden, unhygienic conditions where things like cholera, typhoid, you name it, swept through the buildings like urban brush fires. Their infant daughter died. So there they are in abject poverty, living with the worst kind of loss. And one can imagine Frederika Mandlebaum, as smart and tough as determined as she was, saying, "This is never going to happen to my family and me again. We have to get out of poverty."
So you quote a 20th century criminologist who said, without question, the fullest attribution of energy, presence, and personal magnetism in the literature of criminology belongs to Ma Mandlebaum. So what makes her such a striking figure as a criminal boss?
Well, if you were to do word association with any American, either our age or younger, and you said, "What do you picture when you picture an organized crime boss?" The younger people would picture Tony Soprano, and our cohort would picture probably Bruce Gordon playing Frank Nitti on The Untouchables. In other words, a big, tough, mean guy, heavy emphasis on guy, with pinstripes and spats and a Tommy gun during Prohibition. Mrs. Mandelbaum was none of those things. She went on to have 4 more children. She was, by all accounts, a loving, doting mother of 4. This big, zoftig Jewish woman. She was said to have stood 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds and became fabulously rich. By the time she died in 1894, was said to have a personal fortune of $1 million. That's 1894 dollars, probably 20 million or so today. And she was a woman, and she had working for her a cohort, an army of foot soldiers, high-end shoplifters, high-end housebreakers, jewel thieves, and eventually bank burglars. She planned the burglaries, and she earned her income as a fence, a receiver of stolen goods. And she eventually became so rich, she could have lived anywhere, but she remained in Klein-Deutschland on the Lower East Side by choice. Her people were there. Her community was there. Her foot soldiers were there. But she had this opulent apartment on the upper floors of her modest haberdassery shop that was the front for her business. And there it is. It looked upstairs like the Palace of Versailles. And she would have these huge, lavish black tie dinner parties. And there she is on the far right with the fan, where down one side of the table in evening dress would be the foremost criminals in America. Down the other side would be some of the foremost men in legitimate commerce, Wall Street types, mercantile types, and of course, major figures in the Tammany Hall machine, all laughing, whining, and dining happily. And because of the tender care that she lavished on her crooks and on her own children, both criminals and the press would call her Ma, Mother, or Marm Mandelbaum. Now, when has a crime boss ever looked like that?
So
Fair
I
enough.
want to get more into kind of how she built her empire, but you just again to kind of start, you say that America is in the 1850s is undergoing a transformation, and that Marm is able to get her start as a result of this, and it gives her some room to operate in. So maybe you could describe a little bit what's going on with America and how is Marm taking advantage of this, or what is the opportunity that she's finding in this?
In their first years in the New World, to the early 1850s, both Frederika and her husband Wolf worked as street peddlers. She, we know, sold lace door to door. It's very clear, as one historian says, that street peddling, is the bottom level of business activity. And Frederika would have learned from experience right away that if she wanted to pull her family out of poverty, peddling wasn't going to get it done. Her genius was that she was able to look around and see what the market would bear based on what was happening in the culture. What was happening in the culture in the mid 19th century, thanks to urbanization, industrialization and the growth of professional work was you had a new middle class emerging. And at the same time, you had all sorts of mass produced high end consumer goods flooding the market. And thanks to ubiquitous ads in newspapers, magazines, the domestic advice books aimed at middle class women, a craving was set up. You had fanning of the flames of middle class desire. Well, Frederika knew that middle class women, particularly, were under great pressure to keep up with the Joneses by glutting their parlors with every kind of fine furniture and lamps and doilies and knickknacks and bric-a-brac and rugs, every kind of tchotchke. Now, even a middle class family couldn't afford all those things. Not anyway at full price. And what these middle class people were discovering was you could circumvent that problem with clandestine visits to your friendly neighborhood fence. We know that by the end of the 1850s, Mrs. Mandlebaum had done an apprenticeship with two older Jewish men who were master fences, and she eventually amassed enough capital to strike out on her own as a solo entrepreneur. One of the things that struck me most about her story, I knew, of course, it was women's history. I knew it was historical true crime, but at bottom, it's a business story. It's the tale of entrepreneurship where she is both living out and subverting the great American Horatio Alger rags to riches story.
So this is taking place in the Gilded Age, the age of robber barons, industrialists whose business practices were often considered ruthless or unethical. And that's kind of a striking part of this time period, perhaps of every time period. But does that make it easier or harder for someone like Mandlebaum to succeed? How does her story taking place in the time of the robber barons, how do they affect each other?
It's very clear that the so-called upper world, the world of legitimate commerce, where you had Vanderbilts and Astors and Rockefellers winning their uptown fortunes through tactics that included bribery, suborning perjury, cornering markets, making hostile takeovers, hiring the Pinkertons to break up strikes, and sometimes killing people in the bargain. Yet that was considered above the law. In the underworld, on a simultaneous track, you had people like Frederika Mandlebaum, whose activities were considered against the law. And so if you are an underworld figure trying to climb what has been called the crooked ladder, the only way that you can ensure your safety and that you and your people will stay out of prison is to make alliances with the so-called upper world. And that is exactly what Frederika did. The people around her table included not only well-dressed and well-scrubbed criminals, but well-dressed and well-scrubbed bankers, Wall Street men, business tycoons, and most important of all, politicians and high-ranking police officials. That whole world, it's been called the Flash Age in New York in the 1860s, 70s, the post-Civil War period, was a time when everyone, upper world and underworld, was on the make. And so very, very often they had common interests that could be allied.
So you there's some great use of language and references to now kind of long dead slang in the book that really sets the scene. And one of the that you mentioned was Battle Row Ladies Social and Athletic Club, and maybe you could just kind of briefly describe them and lead into another point you make that women had sort of a unique role in gang life. So what was that?
Well, what people know about the underworld in that period. Of course, a lot of it comes from Herbert Asbury. And as we know, as historians, Asbury has to be taken cum grano salis. But some of his stuff
Okay, I'm
was
sorry.
correct.
I'm sorry. Whoa. Con grano salis, please. I'm just a dumb guy from East Providence, Rhode Island. What does that mean?
Oh, well, that explains it. Asbury, Asbury, as we know, has to be taken with a grain of salt, and modern historians reading Gangs of New York say, he was not an academic historian, he was a journalist, and there were at least times when he didn't let facts, strictly speaking, stand in the way of a good story. But Tyler Anbinder, who wrote this wonderful book on the 5 points, contemporary historian, says Asbury is usually reliable. So what we know from Asbury, the gangs of New York were, all of these young street toughs who were stealing things on the waterfront, who might mug people. Their brand of crime was what I and others have called disorganized. It was ad hoc. It was opportunistic. You saw a woman coming out of a shop with a bundle and you knocked her down and took the bundle. You stole someone's purse. It was very rarely planned in advance. It was often violent. It was not especially remunerative. And so there were also comparable gang organizations of women with wonderful names like the Battle Row Ladies Social and Athletic Club that was helmed by a woman named Battle Annie, who was considered the champion brick hurler of the West Side. But as I say, the women in this period, say 1850s-ish, were like the men, they were bruisers rather than business people. And this is the thing. Frederika Mandlebaum was clearly one of the first people to take the disorganized, unremunerative business of petty New York street crime and turn it into a well-oiled, organized, albeit underworld, capitalist machine. She really corporatized it. And what she did actually anticipated by a couple of decades the work of late 19th century efficiency experts, the best known of whom was Frederick Winslow Taylor, who gave us Taylorism. But her goal was absolutely of a piece with theirs: increased profitability through increased organizational efficiency.
So one thing that, excuse me, I'm fascinated by, so a good deal of the theft and fencing that Mrs. Mandelbaum is involved with doesn't involve jewels or fancy watches or gold bars. It involves cloth, in particular silk. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because that was like, really, we're stealing and dealing in stolen silk, and this is a big deal, and it turns out it is.
Absolutely. And I'll get to the silk in a moment. One of the things that totally persuaded me that Frederika Mandlebaum was a brilliant businesswoman, although, of course, she'd never been to university, much less business school, but she had a genius for putting her finger to the wind and seeing what was going on in the prevailing economic climate and how she, from her underworld position, could capitalize on it. And one of the things she did, like any good businesswoman who deals in stuff, in material products, was she chose very early 2 product lines in which to specialize. Now, she would fence anything. There's a wonderful 19th century article that talks about her once having resold 50,000 stolen cigars. What do you do with 50,000 cigars? But the products in which she specialized and which she enjoined her foot soldiers to steal the most were 2 things: diamonds and silk. Now, I'm going to be Socratic and ask you guys, of all of the hundreds of material goods flooding America at that time, why those 2 products? Thoughts?
Well, diamonds are small and you can move them around pretty easily.
easy to dispose of somehow or
You're in
create?
the right area. It's
Okay.
because both of those, diamonds and silk, have enormous value relative to weight. So, indeed, you can pinch them easily, carry them away quietly, but even in small quantities, they're going to fill your coffers. Now, the silk is fascinating because from the silk, we really get a window onto what was happening in American, literally material culture of the period. Fine fabrics, especially silk, had almost the status of an underground currency, and for a fence like Frederika Mandlebaum, stolen silk was very productive. Why? Because there was no ready-to-wear clothing for women. One of the things that really blew my mind doing the research for this book is that a woman, an American woman, could not walk into a shop and buy a skirt or shirtwaist off the rack until the 1890s, and she couldn't buy a dress off the rack until after World War One. What this meant was for this whole second half of the 19th century, where Frederica made her fortune, all women, rich and poor, either made their own clothes at home or had them made by a dressmaker. And that meant that fine fabrics like silk were in wide, unremitting, perennial demand. And Frederica had the savvy to literally capitalize on that.
So we've had a question come in, and this
Mhm.
is from Wally Morrison, and he would like to know, were her contemporary mob figures tolerant or intolerant of her rise to wealth and power? And if they resented it, what did they do about it?
That's a wonderful question. Um, I think what saved her from that kind of opprobrium were a couple of things. One, there were more than enough pieces of pie to go around. New York had already become the nation's premier center of manufacturing and import export. The waterfront docks were piled with stuff, for the taking by your foot soldiers. And so the economy of New York, just as it supports today many financial houses down on Wall Street, there was more than enough for New York to support a number of competing fences, competing crime bosses. Um, the other thing that's interesting and for me was kind of redemptive about Mrs. Mandelbaum's career and gave me permission to not only write about her, but even find her kind of charming, was that her brand of organized crime, unlike what came later when the boys muscled in, was almost entirely nonviolent. She was only interested in property crime. And what she did and where she made her money was from what might euphemistically be called the redistribution of private property. And in fact, many ordinary citizens, and of course many crooks, venerated her as a kind of Robin Hood figure, where she robbed from the rich. They plundered, the stately homes of wealthy New Yorkers, wealthy Americans. She had agents and thieves all over the country. It was really a national network she presided over. And she robbed from the rich and gave, or rather sold at below wholesale discount to the country's new bourgeoisie. So there was a level on which everybody benefited and nobody got hurt. She wasn't whacking people. That came later.
I want to remind everybody that we're chatting with Margot Fox, who is the author of The Talented Mrs. Mandelbaum. And Margot, eventually, she might be specializing in diamonds and silk, but eventually she gets involved with bank robbery. And I was impressed to discover that these particular bank robbers that she's involved with 150 years ago are pretty much every bit as sophisticated as the thieves in Ocean's 11. So how did she get involved in that? And what can you tell us about what you referred to, particularly, to use your phrase, as bank burglary in the
Ah,
in the late 1800s?
as I learned, I don't think I've ever learned more researching any of my 5 books than I have in this book. And it was a an exhilarating education. Although we all, including me, bandy about the terms bank robbery and bank burglary more or less interchangeably, and usually we just say bank robbery, they denote two very different ways from separating a bank from its contents. Bank robbery refers to the in-person, during business hours, armed stick 'em up affair where you go to a teller and say, I have a gun, or if you're Woody Allen, I have a gub, give me all your money. That obviously can be lucrative, but among the rarefied criminals with whom Mrs. Mandelbaum built her empire, it's considered thuggish and déclassé and kind of beneath contempt. What her people did was bank burglary. That's the after hours, nighttime, stealthy affair. You probably don't even need a gun because the tellers aren't working. Everyone's gone home. But what you do need are the patience and the smarts and the tools and the financial backing to surveil a bank in the neighborhood for months, sometimes years, to map out how you're going to get in. Are you going to tunnel in from the next building? Are you going to pick the lock of the front door? And then once you're in the bank, how do you get into the safe? You don't want to blow it up because that can blow up all the money you're going after. And so this was considered in the canon of thieves, where there are really different echelons of finesse and competence and skill. Bank burglars were considered the highest artists of all, the Paganinis of criminals. So that's the difference between bank robbery and bank burglary. How Mrs. Mandelbaum thought to get into it is, again, a window onto a changing America. This fascinated me. From movies and TV, we think that bank robbery, bank burglary was always a going concern in America. Not so. Before the Civil War, bank burglary was relatively rare. Why? Because America was on the gold standard. And think of the physical onus of being a burglar. You've plundered a mass of gold, and then, with your bones aching and your shoulders sagging, you go clanking heavily and noisily down the street. You have to load it into a carriage and hope your poor horse doesn't drop dead hauling all that stuff away. Then along comes the Civil War. Until then, even organized criminals had pretty much given banks a wide berth. It wasn't good value for money. The stuff was too heavy. Then comes the Civil War, and with it the Union's urgent need to raise money to wage it. And so suddenly Lincoln authorizes a flood of paper money, fiat money, backed not by gold or silver, but simply by the government's word. Suddenly the country is flooded with millions and millions, and this is millions and millions of 1860s dollars, in greenbacks, paper bills. Now remember Mrs. Mandelbaum's rule of product specialization: great value relative to weight. Well, by its very nature, paper money has just that. And the underworld did a happy dance. They knew immediately that from all this money, there was money to be made. And it was only then that bank burglary really began to come into its own.
Well, one of the things that struck me is, as she's becoming so powerful, is just how well known she is. Not only, in New York or basically all of the United States, but internationally. So could you talk a bit about how that occurs? Is she kind of promoting herself, or how? I would think that being an international celebrity would be somewhat detrimental to running a covert criminal operation.
That's right. And
that's really not in this case.
I should add that the one big obstacle I faced as a journalist wanting to write her story was Frederika Mandlebaum left no personal papers, that anyone has ever found. And historians have written dissertations on her, so people have looked besides me. And it's very clear to me, she was nobody's fool, and she knew in her line of work it would have been suicide to commit anything to paper. But what she did leave was this extraordinary evidentiary trail in the form of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of period newspaper articles and wonderful things in all sorts of archives. We actually found, in this age when lots of important people are getting indicted, we found her indictment from 1894, when her reign as a crime boss came to an end and the law started to close in. But in her day, from her rise in the late 1850s, for 25 years until her downfall in 1884, she was literally world famous. Her death in 1894, for instance, was covered as far away as London. She was, during her 25-year reign, the subject of myriad newspaper articles, editorial cartoons, and there were even, remarkably, 2 stage plays with characters based on her. If you said the name Mother Mandlebaum to not only any New Yorker, but a great many Americans, they'd know exactly who you were talking about and what she did. And because she was coming to prominence in this age when New York was a wide open town and America more generally was a place where everyone was on the make in the underworld and the upper world, she was able to ply her trade with pretty much complete impunity. And for 25 years, she did not spend as much as a day in jail.
Yeah, so that is a pretty amazing thing. And I think that, I was going to say she's famous by the 1870s, but, for a decade or so, she's just completely avoiding any jail. So has she bribed every policeman in New York, or is she, what's her secret? How is she avoiding that? I mean, because even if you say, well, the police are corrupt, would think that if you're being publicized as being this incredible criminal, that they're going to go, oh, well, we better do something. We better try to stem this.
Very occasionally, the police would be under public pressure to make an arrest, and her shop would be raided. And either she would never even be indicted. She'd just be released right away. Now, remember, a lot of the people around her groaning table, eating off of her fine china, sitting under her crystal chandeliers, drinking wine from her extensive cellars, being waited on by her big staff of servants. A lot of those people were Tammany Hall pals, including judges. A lot of those people were very senior officials of the New York Police Department. And in those years, and my book explains more fully why she was literally able to spend not so much as a day in jail for 25 years, from 1859, when her career began, to 1884, when things started to fall apart and the law finally closed in on her. And it is because of the palms she greased, the connections she made. Remember, being a policeman didn't pay very well then. So let's say there was ample room for bribery. Policemen's wives, like all other women of the period, had to sew their own clothes. They too needed silk at discount prices. So her shop was patronized by all sorts of people, including those who, let's say, were in a great position to help her and keep her safe.
And Chris, can I do a follow-up question here?
Just once.
Because only time forever and ever. I'll never ask again. You use a phrase, and I didn't know if this was something that you made up or something that comes to you through the archives that you've researched, the Bureau for Prevention of Conviction. Mm-hmm. Tell us about that.
That wonderful phrase was said, acidly, astringently, by a not corrupt policeman, a man with the wonderful name of George Washington Walling, who was the chief of New York police during much of Frederika's rise. And he, in looking around, I suspect he was not invited to her fancy parties, but he knew well the kind of figures who were around her dinner table, who included the Tammany Pauls, the high-ranking police, people, in other words, in great position to help her to see that if she, on those rare times when she was raided or arrested, that the case just never came to trial. And he called that coterie of so-called upper world figures, the city hall politicians, Mrs. Mandelbaum's Bureau for the Prevention of Conviction. And for 25 years, that bureau did its job for her.
I think one of the other things that I was intrigued by, obviously, a lot of the caricatures of her, I would say, border on the anti-Semitic, and I thought it was interesting that in one of the indictments that you have in the book, they list her and some of her children who have been born in America, and it says, Mrs. Mandelbaum, Jewess or German Jewess, and her children as German Jews, and they're Americans. So maybe you could comment a little bit about that aspect of the story, and what kind of people's perceptions of her and how that plays into it.
Yeah, the sort of casual, knee-jerk, thoughtless anti-Semitism that was rife in 19th century discourse and unfortunately has not gone away, was very much present in coverage of Frederika Mandelbaum and her family. And indeed, some of the caricatures in magazines show her with the classic hooked nose and the sort of heavy brows and dark scowling features. In 1884, when she was finally arrested and indicted, in coverage of some of the pretrial court appearances that she made, New York papers, including the New York Times, my own paper, would say she is a German Jewess with coarse, heavy, mannish features. And so not only the anti-Semitism, but the misogyny and the xenophobia that had precluded for her and so many immigrants like her any ability to advance in legitimate business, in legitimate society, in the upper world, and which forced many of them to climb this crooked ladder. Uh, those forces were alive and well, and they disenfranchised Frederika and people like her from the beginning. And when her career started to falter because American society had changed by the 1880s. The coverage of her downfall, there was really no holds barred in that kind of language and those kind of caricatures. And needless to say, for me, as a 21st century American Jewish woman, it's very painful to read that stuff, but
Yeah.
it has to be noted.
Yeah, well, I was struck by, I mean, one of the plays you mentioned in the book, one of the stage productions about her life, she's in the audience and she comes down and kind of reams out the actors saying, "Do you really think I look like this?"
There's a wonderful scene. I'm very proud of this. There was a kind of blind quote from a criminal who came a little after her, sort of late 19th century, saying there was once this stage play and Mrs. Mandelbaum got all dressed up and went to see it. The play was not named, but I found it. It was a French play originally called Les Deux Orphelines, the Two Orphans, that appeared in New York in English translation in the 1870s. And by the way, it was filmed as a silent that you can still see by D.W. Griffith, called Orphans,
Wow.
Orphans of the Storm, starring Lillian and Dorothy Gish as the orphans. And it is this play that Mrs. Mandelbaum, in her lavish silk gowns and her expensive diamonds, sat in a box and went to sea. And we know this because there's actually a newspaper account of her in her private box. When she saw the actress, and the actress is, it's a character named Mother Frochard. She's the matriarch of a Parisian crime family, really scandalous, murderous grifters. When Mrs. Mandelbaum saw the actress that played Mother Frochard take the stage, and she was costumed in this basically frumpy, house dress and bad makeup. And I was thrilled to find a production still from that play that is reproduced in the book. Mrs. Mandelbaum was so incensed that she was portrayed in this frowsy way that at intermission she summoned the manager of the theater and gave him a good tongue lashing. So she had, and I love that story because it tells you how much pride she took in how far she had come. She was a career criminal. She ordered a cadre of dozens of foot soldiers to commit crimes for her benefit. We cannot lose sight of that. So kids, stay in school. Don't do like she did. But here was this woman who came in steerage, lived in the worst kind of poverty, lost her first child to the disease-ridden tenement conditions. And boy, did she pull herself up by her bootstraps and became, a multimillionaire with a chest full of jewels and a closet full of silks. And whatever we think about how she got there, it is a pretty remarkable journey.
Margot, she's married and has children. So is her husband and children, are they involved in her criminal enterprises?
Her husband, Wolf, this same police captain, George Washington Walling, whose memoir has many wonderful passages about his dealings with Frederika Mandlebaum. And it's clear he has a kind of grudging admiration for her and how clever she was and how successful. He says, and it's such a wonderful quote, it's burned into my memory. He said, "The woman took the lead in these nefarious transactions. She was a thorough businesswoman. Her husband was a non-entity." So it's pretty clear that the don't ask, don't tell relationship that you have to have when you are a receiver of stolen goods. Oh, you've bought me some lovely diamonds. Don't tell me where you got them. It's pretty clear that that relationship extended to her marriage. Wolf continued his work as a peddler. He seemed to be largely, if not entirely, uninvolved in her growing fencing business and her growing renown as an underworld captain of crime. And then sadly in 1875, when they'd been married for 20 some years, he died, probably of consumption. And so she was now a rich widow with 4 children who was now the sole support of her family. So her empire continued to grow without him.
So kind of in expanding the family circle there a bit, though, maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of her gang, for lack of a better term, and what was it she did to create this loyalty in people, and how was she able to attract the people she attracted and convince them to do the things that she needed them to do? Because she doesn't use violence, as far as we know.
There were a number of business incentives, I guess what we would call perks today. And she attracted several different strata of thieves. Again, she builds her business small, just as you don't come with the ink still wet on your MBA and go to a Fortune 500 company and walk in and say, "I'm here to become the CEO." You start at the bottom, and so did she. She started first by recruiting the cadre of female shoplifters that were already starting to circulate in department stores, which were just coming into their own in major American cities in the mid-19th century. And what she can give them is the promise of steady work, the assurance of bail money if they are ever arrested. For a time, she even put some of her best thieves on a weekly salary. She had the most corrupt law firm in America, Howe and Hummel, which basically represented the entire New York underworld, on a $5,000 a year retainer. That's over $100,000 today. So there was security and solidarity and also conviviality in being part of the Mandelbaum organization. You got to go to these fabulous dinner parties. She had dances. She had company picnics for employees. After the female shoplifters, when she realized she wanted to get into silk, and not just little silk handkerchiefs that the women could steal from a store counter, but big bolts of silk that had to be lifted from warehouses or textile emporiums or waterfront docks, then she started recruiting a cadre of big, strong, capable men. After them came the jewel thieves. After them came the bank burglars. But again, there was the upside was you had sometimes a regular salary, you had bail. And my favorite thing, just because to us it sounds so quaint, she would also supply getaway horses and carriages when you needed to flee the scene of a crime. Now, it's 1860, 1870. What else was there? But to us, it sounds so charming, where you've just knocked over a bank. Quick, the police are coming. You have to make your getaway. What do? You climb into your carriage and you genteelly clippity-clop slowly away from the crime scene, kind of the original white Bronco chase. But she gave them all that. She really did. She really earned the title Mother Mandelbaum. That's the upside. The downside is there is that iron fist in the velvet glove, where she has all the dope on you. She knows every crime you've committed because you've done most of them on her orders. And so if you displease her for any reason, she can throw you to the police as a sacrificial fish. And that's another thing that kept her out of trouble for 25 years, is on those rare occasions when the cops were under public pressure to make an arrest and make a big show of promoting law and order, she and any other crime boss would throw them these sacrificial lambs, smaller people in their organization, people they wanted to get rid of, and those people would be hauled off to jail. There wouldn't be a thing they could do about it, and that would buy Mrs. Mandelbaum and the other crime bosses, another few months or few years of safety. So it was this push-pull thing where she was mothering you with one hand, but always threatening to slap you down with the other.
Margot, I had never heard of Mrs. Mandelbaum before I read your book. The time period you deal with in this book is the 1860s to the 1890s, and I've heard of plenty of criminals from that period. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, John Wesley Hardin, Butch Cassidy, but they're all from the West, and they're all kind of small potatoes, relatively speaking. So why do we remember them and not, Marm Mandelbaum and the gangs of New York?
Well, here, of course, I can only make an educated guess. One, as I mentioned, is because she left no personal papers. And when you leave that, when you fail to leave personal papers, you've done two things. You've pretty much ensured your own safety, but you've also ensured, whether you want this to be the case or not, that you do not endure for posterity. Because how can anyone know about you if you've left no journal, no archive, nothing behind? So she, in effect, wiped herself off of the face of public discourse by committing nothing to paper. And the other thing is, it's a classic case of women's history. We see this time and time and time again, because much of our received history of 19th century figures was written by men, either in the 19th century or the early to mid 20th century. And so, like so many people in women's history, Frederika Mandlebaum simply slipped into a crevice in time. And it's been a great privilege for me, but also rather difficult to lever her out of that crevice, because there are things we will just never know.
Mm. So, Rick, do we have time for one more? Or we?
Yeah, we got time for one more.
Yeah, well, I just, we're not going to get into what brought her down and how it all ended, because you need to buy the book to read that and find out. And that is a fascinating read, I will say. Now kind of knowing a little bit more about her, or a lot more about her, would you say what was her kind of, if any, her impact on organized crime, or how that all came about? I mean, since she's the first and she put some procedures in place, is she a source of inspiration, or does she change the game at all, or is she just, kind of a unique time and place?
Really both. They're not mutually exclusive. My feeling is she didn't change the game. We're careful, as one always has to be in writing history, with claims of firstness or lastness or bestness to do anything. So we are careful not to call her the first organized crime boss, but we are absolutely safe to call her, as we do, the first great or the first major organized crime boss, because she was really the first one to streamline and commodify and literally corporatize, and therefore literally be able to capitalize on crime, which until her had been kind of ad hoc and random and scattershot, not planned, not especially lucrative. And so clearly that model of corporate efficiency for crime, even for crime, as well as for all of the other upper world businesses that were getting going in America at that time, clearly her model in the crime world endured, and certainly was run with and expanded on and made even more lucrative by the organized criminals and bosses who came after her. So I would absolutely argue that was her contribution, was kind of a triumph of business in its way.
Well, Margalit, thank you so much for joining us today to chat about your book, The Talented Mrs. Mandlebaum, The Rise and Fall of an American Organized Crime Boss. Definitely worth the read. It's your second time on History Happy Hour. When you get to 5 times, we'll give you a hat, but that's 3 books away. So, maybe it may be a while, but we're holding that hat for you.
I'll write faster.
Okay, please.
Excellently done. Margot, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Great book. Lots of fun to read.
Fun.
Chris, next week, we have a very big book.
Not so much fun.
Not a good book, but,
really?
not a lighthearted book. The subject is the Battle of Antietam, which is the single bloodiest day in American history. And our guest is historian Scott Hartwig, author of what some people are calling the definitive history of this battle. I dread the thought of the place, which is a quote from someone who fought there. The Battle of Antietam and the End of the Maryland Campaign. So perhaps it's not appropriate for this book that neither of us will be in the United States of America at the time that we do that interview, but that is.
So we'll be thinking about it.
We'll be thinking about what interesting things happened there at the Battle of Antietam, which is quite a great story. So that is next week. Looking forward to that.
We'll live again.
Yeah, we're live for the next 2 weeks, and then I think we have a few weeks of shows. But I don't know. I have to look at the list and figure it out. I'm not sure. Yeah. Hey guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook. Shout at us on X, which used to be called Twitter. Listen to our podcast. Back us. I didn't even, when I looked at that in my notes, I was like, what does that mean? Back us on Patreon. Back us on Patreon. That's the most important one. And browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.